Hi, everyone. Welcome to Smarter News. My name is Jenna, and we have a special report for you today. A moment to take a deep breath, a great moment to pause. And it feels like just the right time for that because the beginning of the year, the month of January, feels like it got shot out of a cannon, doesn't it? All of a sudden, you wake up and it's the end of February. You wonder how you got here. That's certainly how I feel. And the amount of different headlines that we've covered just in the first few weeks of 2024 really has been coming at a rapid fire pace, and it's only going to get quicker and more intense as we move towards election day 2024. And so I thought we have a really unique opportunity. Here we are in a presidential election year. We are marking George Washington's birthday slash President's Day. So let's take a moment and reflect a little bit about American leadership. And I thought strategically, this makes a lot of sense. We at Smarter News, we love covering the headlines for you. We want you to feel current, clear, clutter free. We want you to know the headlines and why it matters. But every once in a while, it's good to pause and take a step back from the headlines and not be driven by them so that we can think a little bit more deeply about what's actually happening in the country and some of the stories that we're reporting and also telling each other about the state of affairs. When you dig deeper into a lot of the news stories that we cover, and I've always been amazed by this over the years, at the heart of a lot of these stories are similar themes, even though they look drastically different. Themes like patriotism, liberty, personal freedom, justice, questions of what does American leadership really look like? What does success really mean? Some of these really basic, broad themes that we never get a chance to really dig into because we're moving from one story to the next. So today's actually going to give us the opportunity to do that. And we're going to do that through a tradition that's been taking place in Congress for many, many years. And that's the tradition of reading President Washington's farewell address. And there's a reason why Congress decided to do this many years ago and why the Senate continues to do it. It's because the words have incredible power. And you have to think back to when they were written in the 1790s. The farewell address was actually published in 1796, just a few years before President Washington died. And even though they were written so many years ago, you can see how deeply they resonate today and how some of the same questions that were being asked of America in 1790 are now still being asked in America. It almost makes you feel less alone that some of these big questions that we're tackling aren't necessarily super unique to us. It's a real question about America. What do we stand for? And what is America all about? And every election cycle, we have the opportunity to dig deeper into this, and we're lucky in a country like America that actually we have the opportunity to talk about it more frequently. But let's talk a little bit about how we even have a holiday like George Washington's birthday slash President's Day. And why do I keep saying that? The reason is because the real federal holiday, the national holiday, is George Washington's birthday. That's official. In your state, you may actually be celebrating President's Day. I looked in the calendar in Texas. We celebrate President's Day in Texas, the third Monday in February. But the state of New York, for example, still celebrates George Washington's birthday. So it sort of depends on where you are, but the federal holiday continues to be George Washington's birthday. And the tradition of celebrating the birthday of the first president goes back to the immediate years after his death. Really, unofficially, Americans were celebrating George Washington's birthday for many, many years. And his official birthday is February 22nd. He was born February 22nd, 1732. He was born in the area of Virginia. He's the descendant of a tobacco trader who wound up in this area because of a shipwreck. He ends up marrying a landowner's daughter in the mid 1600s. So President George Washington born February 22nd, 1732. And although his birthday was celebrated by Americans for many, many years, it wasn't officially celebrated by the federal government until the 1870s. And you have to think about that time. So the 1870s, we're talking about after the Civil War. You have the emergence of a new, perhaps more high profile federal government. And this federal government's now going to make some more national holidays, President Washington's birthday being one of them. Before the Civil War, and really when you go back to the founding of America, there was a real anathema to a big, strong, powerful, rich federal government because there was a real concern about building another monarchy. But after the Civil War, you sort of see this shift a little bit. And some could argue that we've been in this shift and the back and forth between state rights and the federal government rights, for all time in America. But here we have the federal government now making some more federal holidays, and George Washington's birthday is one of them. It wasn't until the 1960s, so 1968, when there was an act passed by Congress called the Uniform Monday Holiday Act. That act became law in 1971, and that's how we get 3-day holidays. You see, February 22nd, George Washington's birthday was celebrated wherever it fell. So if it fell on a Wednesday or a Saturday, it didn't really matter. It was still a holiday. But in modern times, what we did is we made this more uniform to have these 3-day weekends. And there was thinking behind it that this was going to be good for the economy. There was going to be more sales, more travels, more recreation. Federal workers are going to get 3 days, they get that 3-day holiday, all of that. That's going to be great for America. And so that was the thinking behind this act of Congress. And that's essentially how we got President's Day. The President's Day and that term President's Day, it's a real natural thing to say because Abraham Lincoln's birthday is February 12th. George Washington's birthday is February 22nd. So we have two really high profile presidents who have their birthday in February. So it's not like a long shot to call it President's Day. But apparently that really came from retail campaigns. And that's how we started to get that term being used more often. President's Day. This is President's Day weekend, even though the official holiday is George Washington's birthday. And that's how we see different states sort of slowly adopt maybe a different way of referring to the third Monday in February, which hopefully for you is a day off or maybe a lighter workload. I know it's not a day off for everybody, but that's where we get this idea of President's Day. So that's a little overview about how we got this holiday in February. But now let's talk about this tradition that's been ongoing related to George Washington's birthday. And to do that, we have to go back to 1796. It's 20 years after the Declaration of Independence. President Washington has served 2 terms. He had previously thought about not necessarily continuing to serve as president. And so he crafted a message with James Madison at the time, years earlier, to explain why he wasn't going to run again, why he wasn't going to serve as president. But he ended up he ended up continuing to serve, and finally it was time. It was the end of the second term. He wasn't going to run again. And so with the help of Alexander Hamilton, who was then the Secretary of Treasury. I mean, think about that. The Secretary of Treasury and the president having such a close relationship that the Secretary of Treasury is helping the president write his farewell address. And so this farewell address, which was several years in the making with a lot of deep thoughts, was actually published in a newspaper. That's the interesting fact about this. Even though I'm going to read this out loud to you today, read out loud excerpts from it, just know that we never heard President Washington say any of these words. It was published in Philadelphia's American Daily Advertiser. And that's how the nation learned that President Washington was going to essentially retire. And he actually uses that term in the farewell address that he's going to go relax, which doesn't necessarily seem to be the case and sounds perhaps more difficult. Perhaps is more difficult than it sounds for all of us, but including the first president of a new nation. But that's where the farewell address was first published in this Philadelphia newspaper, and it's a long address. It's more than 7,000 words. When I printed it out today, because I was old-fashioned about it, came to about 30 pages. And there's a lot in here. One of the things, if you look at Mount Vernon, the Mount Vernon website for George Washington's home, and it's a great site with a lot of little historic tidbits. They say that really the farewell address included a caution from the first president on 3 interrelated dangers that threatened to destroy the Union: regionalism, partisanship, and foreign entanglements. Let me read that to you again. Does that sound familiar? Regionalism, partisanship, and foreign entanglements. This is what President Washington was worried about. These were some of his concerns. So he used the farewell address not necessarily to reflect on himself at all. It was more of like unsolicited advice to the nation and some of his observations about things that we should consider. And that's how it's written. And in fact, that's how he starts. He starts with a reference to friends and fellow citizens. Think about that. He could have said fellow citizens, but it was friends and fellow citizens. And that's how he begins this address. So what I did today is I was thinking about reading the whole thing to you, but it's really quite too long. Some of the language can be very difficult. It's from a different time, and I want this to be easy for you. I don't want it to be another thing that you have to add to your list or something you have to work at. But I thought there were some really key points that were really important. So I pulled those out. The key points related to things like regionalism, partisanship, and foreign entanglements so that we can reflect on them together. The Senate every single year reads the entire farewell address. That tradition goes back to 1862. During the Civil War, it was looked at or described as a morale boosting gesture. Think about that. The nation's at war. This is going to recenter us about what really matters and what's important. And you can imagine how some of what George Washington talks about between the differences of North, South, East, and West, how much they would resonate during that time. And so there was an idea to do this. And both houses of Congress, in like a joint session, listened to the farewell address. And then the tradition continues many years later. In the Senate, it becomes more of a tradition every year, starting in the 1890s. The House ends up doing this too, by the way, but the Senate is the one that has consistently carried it on year after year. And it doesn't always hit directly on February 22nd, George Washington's birthday, but it's in and around that time period. One year, a Republican will read, the next year, a Democrat will read. They will alternate. And then at the end of their reading of the speech, they actually get to write their name in a leather bound book. And they also get to include some of their comments. And apparently, those comments have changed over the years, but they become part of this tradition of reading these words for everyone to hear. And so this is an honor in the Senate. It's going to actually take place this year. Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland's going to be the person that's going to be reading. He's a Democrat, and he's going to be retiring. He's no longer going to be serving after his term. And so this is an honor that is being given to him. And so next year it'll be a Republican. And that's how the tradition continues, a tradition to read something out loud that never was ever read out loud by the original writer, President George Washington. So today, that's what we're going to do. I have my cheat sheets in front of me just so you can hear. This is the 30 pages. I thought it was good. I thought everyone should have the farewell address printed out and kept in their desk at one time or the other. So I have it. I'm going to keep it. Don't worry, it's not going to be wasted or recycled. But I've also pulled out some of these parts that I think are really important to listen to. So as I mentioned, 1796. This is printed apparently in September, and there's going to be an election. And so George Washington begins his his essay with friends and fellow citizens. And he goes on to say to his reader that essentially the election is upon us. I'm not running, but I have a few thoughts. And these few thoughts are around things like the federal government, political parties, and foreign policy. So he launches fairly quickly after a little bit of a windup. He launches into the importance of the federal government. And you have to think about this at the time. Again, regionalism is a hot topic. We have the Union of States, but it was tough to get there. There was a terrible war that was fought. There's still a lot of differences in the state and between the states. And certainly, even just getting the founders to agree was a difficult task. But they knew that they had to come together in order to battle the monarchy. So this was fraught, and President Washington sat through a lot of these debates and a lot of these arguments. So imagine him coming from that perspective. Everyone also is not quickly in communication. There's not social media, they're not texting each other. They're periodically coming together face to face to talk. And so that's sort of the environment that we're in now. Many years after the end of the American Revolutionary War, not that many, by the way, just a few years after the American Revolutionary War. And now with this question of like, well, what are we going to become now? We fought for all this, but what are we going to become now? So here's how he writes about the unity of government. Quote, the unity of government, which constitutes you, one people, is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is a main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize. But as it is easy to foresee that from different causes and from different quarters, much pains will be taken, many artifices employed to weaken in your minds the conviction of this truth, as this is the point in your political fortress against which the batteries of internal and external enemies will be most constantly and actively, through often covertly and insidiously, directed. It is of infinite moment that you should properly estimate the immense value of your national union to your collective and individual happiness, that you should cherish a cordial, habitual, and immovable attachment to it, accustoming yourself to think and speak of it as of the palladium of your political safety and prosperity. He goes on to say, citizens by birth or choice of a common country, that country has a right to concentrate your affections. The name of American which belongs to you in your national capacity must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. With slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. You have in a common cause fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and joint efforts, of common dangers, sufferings, and successes. He goes on, in this sense, it is that your union ought to be considered as a main prop of your liberty, and that the love of the one ought to endear to you the preservation of the other. And so you can see there by some of what George Washington is saying, I think it's so interesting for him to say, you like independence, you like where you live, you like your current situation, wherever that is. You have that because of the union. And don't you forget it. Your peace, your prosperity is linked to the union. So don't ever think that it's just you by yourself in your state or your community. You have to pay homage. You have to think about this union as being really important to your life personally. And that's something to see that emphasized by President Washington again after there was so much concern that this federal government could be too powerful and we don't want it to be a monarchy is very interesting. It's a very interesting reflection by America's first president. He goes on from that seamlessly to talk about regionalism and to talk about not talk about the North versus the South, the East versus the West. There's this whole portion in the farewell address where he's talking about the different sort of skills or characteristics of different parts of the country. And that in a lot of ways, he's trying to show how each different side complements each other, how the North complements the South, how the East complements the West. He's trying to sort of paint this picture of how linked everybody is, how interconnected they are. And then he moves from talking about region or regionalism to political parties and making this sort of connection between how regionalism is a party all its own, but political parties are something else. And so let me go ahead and read this part for you. Starts with this quote. I have already intimated to you the danger of parties in the state, with particular reference to the founding of them on geographical discriminations. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. This spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its root in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed. But in those of the popular form, it is seen in its greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy. He goes on. It agitates the community with ill founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which find a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. He goes on. There is an opinion that parties in free countries are useful checks upon the administration of the government and serve to keep alive the spirit of liberty. This, within certain limits, is probably true. And in governments of a monarchical caste, patriotism may look with indulgence if not with favor, upon the spirit of party, but in those of the popular character. In governments purely elective, it is a spirit not to be encouraged. He goes on to talk about the constant danger of excess. It's not just the parties, he says, it's the excess emphasis of them that he's warning against. And this is one of the lines that stands out as he kind of finishes this section where he is very clear that these parties are not good. Let me go back. Ill-founded jealousies, false alarms, animosities, foments occasionally riot and insurrection, opens the door to foreign influence and corruption. I mean, he's not holding back. Like, have your parties and maybe as he points out, maybe in some cases not bad, but when you have elective governments where people are elected, this could consume people to the point that we're not able to function. So that's something really to think about in this election year, isn't it? And this idea of partisan politics. So he goes from that. So he's talking about, again, the importance of the federal government, regionalism, partisanship. And then all of a sudden he turns and he focuses on the outside world. And this is where he spends the bulk of the back half of the address really talking about the outside world and the issues that he foresees on the horizon. And we know that there's many because the European countries and how they're relating to the United States, who we're forming alliances with, who we're not. How do we do that? All these different we have to establish this. We're building this from scratch. How are we going to do it? Who's our friend? Can we get involved in somebody else's conflict? We just got out of a war. Do we even know who we are? You can think about all these things the new country has to deal with. So here's what he says about basically foreign policy. Quote, observe good faith and justice towards all nations, cultivate peace and harmony with all. Religion and morality enjoy this conduct. He writes, the nation which indulges towards another an habitual hatred or an habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and its interest. He continues, a passionate attachment of one nation for another produces a variety of evils. Sympathy for the favorite nation, facilitating the illusion of an imaginary common interest in cases where no real common interest exists. Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens. The jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of republican government. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. So far as we have already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Here, let us stop. I mean, think about that. He's saying, look, you hate someone, you love someone. Either way, you think you have a connection with them that doesn't actually exist. And you think you have a common interest. And when you're thinking about that common interest, you're actually not prioritizing the interest of your own people. You're actually not thinking about America because you're getting confused. And in this section, he talks about emotion. And so he says this is basically going to lead to lack of clarity. You want to go to business, you want to have good trade? Go for it. That sounds great. You want to have political connection, you better think twice. And so that's what he's saying there is that, let's fulfill our obligations, but then let's move on and let's really think about whether or not we want to have these sort of alliances or have adversity with these other countries. Very interesting. He felt very, very strongly about this. And I wish I could understand a little bit more as to why. Why was he feeling so that was so urgent to directly talk to the American people in such a way? I mean, I go back to that line in the parentheses. He says, I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens. I conjure you to believe me. That's a real appeal. Think about that. The president of the United States, please believe me. I'm just telling you, we can't do this. And it splits both ways. I'm not saying we make friendships, and I'm not saying we make enemies. I'm saying we don't do any of that. Very interesting by President George Washington. At the very end of his farewell address, he has this kind of long sentence where he talks about, a pleasing expectation of retreat, And that he kind of went through this whole, like, sentence of saying, this kind of paragraph even ahead of this where he's talking about mistakes that he made and, like, hopefully, like, people won't remember them too much. Like, he's like, "Oh, I probably made some mistakes, but I didn't do it intentionally and I hope they're not remembered." He's kind of it's kind of like a soft way of sort of giving himself this conclusion to his farewell address. And then he talks about, oh, the expectation of this retreat and that he's going to join his fellow citizens. He's going to live under the influence of good laws and a free government and that, favorite object of his heart. And the last portion of the sentence I think is so interesting. He said he's going to, again, under a free government, the ever favorite object of my heart and the happy reward, as I trust, of our mutual cares, labors, and dangers. That's how he ends. The happy reward. He's talking about America. This is the happy reward, as I trust, of our mutual cares, labors, and dangers. I think that's interesting that he put mutual cares, labors, and dangers in that order because he could have said, the happy reward I trust of our mutual labors, dangers, and cares. Like he could have ended more softly than putting dangers as the last word in that sentence. And this is just an opinion. I'm not a historian. And in fact, I'd love to talk to a historian about this. But as I was preparing for this broadcast for you today, I was thinking about that. I just felt like that must have been a real strategic decision and sort of a reminder of what they've all been through, what all of America was through at that time, and a reminder that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was not achieved through peace. It was achieved through war. And there was a lot of dangers that the entire community confronted on a regular basis. Fear of actually losing their lives, whether or not they were actively fighting in the war or not. They could easily be arrested, imprisoned, killed because they were fighting for liberty. And so this happy reward is a reward of mutual work and navigating those dangers. And so it just feels like there's no way that this could have been written for so many years that he was like, let's just put dangers at the end and just like sign my name. It had to be really strategically thought about. And that's how he ends. So you can see there's a lot of things in there just as we're thinking about political parties, thinking about foreign alliances, thinking about all these different stories that are ahead of us that just when we read President Washington's words, you can see the wisdom in there and also the consideration. Can you imagine if there was someone that stood up and said, "You know what? We're not doing any foreign alliances anymore. No foreign alliances, and we're gonna do our best to not have any adversaries. By the way, we're gonna do away with political parties. They're not good. We're actually gonna make them illegal." I don't think you could do that in America, but I'm just thinking about, like, think about the standing up and saying these things. You're gonna remember that the federal government and the Constitution really matters and that any of your freedom, whether you're in Montana or Texas or California or New York, no matter how you're fighting to define that, you are going to always remember that America matters too, and that you're part of a union that is responsible for your peace and prosperity and your pursuit of liberty. Think about the paradigm shift in thinking. So that's why I wanted to read it to you today. That's why I read parts of it every single year. But I thought this year in particular, again, celebrating President's Day, George Washington's birthday, during a presidential election year, reflecting on the wisdom of America's first president and some of his thoughts when he was free to think about what are the words I'm going to leave the American public. Reading those words, recognizing the tradition of multiple generations of Americans to read those words too, and to how in every single part of their times, whether it was during the darkest days of the Civil War, as it was written, in the years after, and the turn of the century, how multiple American leaders have found something in these words to keep them focused and keep them going and give them something to think about. And so I hope that's what we were able to do today is to think about some of George Washington's words. And I'm going to think about them in relation to some of the stories that we're covering. and hopefully weave them into some of our coverage for the rest of the year. So I'll leave you with that today. I'll make sure that his entire farewell address is in our show notes so you can check it out and reread some of these passages yourself and see how some of this is put together and really explore. It's very interesting. It's a very interesting essay, and one that I think has, insurmountable value to all of us. So hope that is a little bit of a deep breath. It's deep thinking, but it's a deep breath. And I'm glad to do it together. We'll be back to our regular news broadcasts and continuing to follow the headlines and why it matters, but always remembering that we can go a little bit deeper and talk about these issues of patriotism, partisanship, regionalism, and foreign policy. Questions about what defines America, what makes us different, and who we want to be. Because we're still a nation that's evolving and creating. And that's one of the exciting things about these election cycles. It's very easy to get stressed about them, but each few years we have the opportunity to reimagine our nation and and work towards that goal. And so I'm going to try to keep that optimism with me, especially when things get busy and a little chaotic, as this year certainly will as we move closer to election day. In the meantime, have a great week. We'll continue to keep you updated with the headlines at smarternews.com, and we'll be right back here with more. Thanks so much for your support of quick, concise, nonpartisan news. Have a great day. I'm Jenna, and this is Smarter News.